that is most important to me, and I've learned that. So when I offer, I like what Matt said about the act of decolonization and what we need to do. So when I think about it in my work, I tend to think about it in structural and systemic and policy-driven ways. The history of how our collections came, again, who those collectors were when they don't represent some of the collections, and then the remaining and following ways we've used description to perpetuate some of that hegemony and how we need to look into that. I mean, we live in a country where our description can be capriciously decided by a very biased Congress, right? So we have a lot of things happening with how we describe our collections that in these systemic ways we need to think about as a field. I think about the notion of gift and the deeds of gift, and also what that means to sovereignty and how we write these deeds of gift. So some of the things I'm talking about here is the administrative, I want to say barrier, but I want to hope those barriers are getting really big holes for us to walk through. So I'm going to say administrative sieves that we're just stretching and trying to get through, because even those silos of say my colleagues in the American Indian Studies Center and other parts of the university, that we can get through those barriers so we can activate the smart and very capable and responsible power of our cultural agents on campus as we work with communities.
Thank you. I don't know if most people know that Library of Congress subject headings are approved by Congress, right? Yeah. So like your congressman has to vote on whether we're allowed to use a certain subject to describe materials in our representatives are. But so Ilaheva, another way, would you like to respond? Important to vote.
And again, thank you all so much for inviting me and for participating and for being here today. I am tuning in from Colorado Springs, Colorado, the land of the Ute Mountain Ute, as well as the Navajo, Cherokee, Shoshone, Kiowa, and many, many others. I began a very traditional English literature degree. And the very first time that I opened up a book about Pacific discovery was from the Northeastern Snow Library collection. And the book had never been opened. I had to cut the pages open in order to, that was so exciting for me, of course. As any archivist knows, that's really exciting, right? But it also told me that this was a giant lack in the 18th century studies, what I was studying right there. And so decolonization provided me with a framework to begin the process of trying to uncenter the United Kingdom for me as a knowledge production center.
Because of the way I recorded the Zoom call, you can hear me make comments in the background. And the most important comment that I was making was that I was saying that for Natalie to find our last name, the Tu'one last name, for the first time in this book that had been untouched for centuries until she picked it up, really made her think twice about European learning centers.
And recenter my perspective, what I like to think of as the view from the shore. No longer thinking of the UK and European knowledge centers as the end-all be-all of knowledge production centers, and instead start imagining
epicenter. Mm-hmm.
other kinds of knowledge production centers, other kinds of knowledge producing, and imagining the possibility that the UK was itself an island waiting to be discovered for the majority of the world in the 18th century.
Give it to them.
That process led me to so many more stories, especially the story of the very first Pacific Islander navigator in England. His name was Mai in 1772.
So Omai, or who they called Mai, became only the second Pacific Islander to visit Europe after somebody named Ahutoru, who was brought to Paris by Bougainville in 1768. Mai was actually renowned for his charm, quick wits, and exotic good looks. According to Wikipedia, he also became a favorite of the aristocratic elites.
And his discovering of England for the Riotian world. Decolonization provided me with a view, being able to reimagine knowledge producing and decenter the UK and recenter other knowledge productions. And so I feel like decolonization has been a very productive model for me and for my work, because we're not done with the colonial age. We are not done colonizing. I participate in colonization right now as I stand on someone else's land.
Could we all just take a second to enjoy this photo of Grandma and her favorite pastime while we paspasi Natalie and her brilliance? When she mentioned that she is still participating in a modern day colonialism, I thought it was a very interesting and powerful concept, because it's true. Our whole family is here because, of course, Grandma and Grandpa's sacrifices. Also, we're here colonizing. So if we don't get it together and learn a little bit more about our history, not just our culture, where would that leave us? Here's Natalie.
And so post-colonial was not enough. I needed to imagine a way of uncolonizing the institutions and the systems, and that I do prefer this term, decolonization. I don't think. I mean, I believe that it will be most productive through acts and policy and returning land. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your really powerful reminder that we're still very much in an age of colonialism. I think that I find it is easy to forget I find it as a white lady very easy to forget that because we talk about it as this abstract thing often in the academy. So I appreciate that reminder. Pua, would you like to round us out?
Yes, aloha. As everyone has already pointed out, I'm so grateful to be here and to get to talk to y'all and nerd out on the internet, which is like every academic stream. And I want to follow in the steps of everyone else who's acknowledged the land that they are on. So I'm a professor at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Obviously, the indigenous folks there are Kanaka Native Hawaiians. And as a diasporic Kanaka, I grew up and went to University of California, Los Angeles. And so I just want to reiterate all of the things Athena has pointed out about the ways folks in those spaces, particularly all of the members of the Institute of American Cultures and all of those centers that she sort of named as these powerful agents for decolonization on campus. As a product of that, I can attest to all of that. And so like, yes, thank you. Keep doing that work. All of those centers that have their own reading rooms, like I am proof that those spaces are powerful. as someone who sat in them and found books that I couldn't find anywhere else there. So yes, all of that is true. So I, like Ilaheva, started out in a traditional English literary studies program. And so I think the way that I come to decolonization in my work is obviously very personal, right? As an Indigenous person, as a Black person. So I have these very personal roots to a lot of the texts that I study, but also to ways of thinking of the decolonial or anti-colonial power in literature. And so a lot of my thinking on that was informed by work by Daniel Heath Justice, Teresia Tewa, who push us in terms of Indigenous context to decolonize what we think of as literature, and therefore the ways that we think of texts as sites of history, and also to challenge us to think about what is archivable. And so I think the ways that Daniel Heath Justice and Teresia Tewa have pushed us to think about things with varying degrees of permanence as literature is especially powerful in an Indigenous context, right? So whether that's like bark cloth, sand paintings, right? I just came from a class where I'm talking about tatau, right? Or tattooing traditions in the Pacific, right? And so what that means to also read the body as a text, right? And not just in some like figurative metaphorical sense, right? But to actually think about the ways our bodies have recorded histories and stories, and how that helps us think through being like living and mobile histories and stories, right? So to me, that is sort of the perspective that I bring to decolonizing what we think of literature. But also I think we touched on this a little bit with our land acknowledgements from all of us, but also to me, a fuller image of what that decolonial or anti-colonial space of knowledge production would be is also really tied to land access, right? So coming to this from a Kanaka perspective, from a larger Pacific Islander perspective, right? A lot of the histories about the land are in the land, right? And if you cannot access that land, like there are obviously ways to maintain your connections to that, right? Whether that's through storytelling, but actually being able to circumvent the colonial institutions and frameworks that limit access to that land, I think in terms of literary studies is an important part of like decolonizing how we think about literature, land as literature, and access to those places.
Well, thank you so much. A theme that seems to be running through all of what you've touched on is this idea of decentering our histories, decentering our perspectives, expanding on the idea of authority, expanding on the idea, like making things less, our academies, our libraries, our disciplines less top-down focused disciplines, which is sort of going to bring us to our next question rather smoothly, which is about the role of public monuments, which I think actually really speaks to what Pua was talking about when it comes to land. So for folks who may not have heard, the Mellon Foundation recently announced a project to reimagine the role of the public monument in American life, including a $4 million grant to the Philadelphia-based Monument Lab. And Mellon defines monuments as storytelling spaces, but not only do monuments, I think, tell a very particular story, but the majority do so in like a really particular static way, at least as they are envisioned by white culture right now. So most consequently, monuments are really public expressions, which I think is what makes them a particularly salient thing for us to talk about today. They are in our space. They are in our spaces, and they are accessible to a lot of folks. And they are the ways in which a lot of people engage with very particular histories. So how can monuments can we re-envision monuments, as Mellon wants to do, to tell other kinds of stories, and embody other ways of telling stories? What is the relationship of public memory making to the archive and the library? And what would an archive accountable to a broad and diverse public look like? So I'm going to open that question up to anybody who would like to start.
I'd be happy to open up a quick answer. I would, if anyone leaves with anything from whatever wisdom or curiosity I have, it's that the library should not be the place to sanitize someone's reputation. Do not think that you should bring a artifact from the external world and place it in the library as a way to minimize their fallibility, their humanity, their dominance, to then tell a narrative that's palatable to one audience. I think that that is something I stand by, and my colleagues across the country stand by. I'm thinking about the work that Elaine Westbrooks and Maria Sorino do with the University of North Carolina statue challenges that have been happening on UNC campus, and the questions that arise about where these these statues should live. So I think about, and it's not just there, there's other places. I've been in universities where maybe it wasn't a statue, but it was an object that would then reify a person's place in history. And we do a disservice to minimizing that story, and really a disservice to giving the memory what it deserves, which is the whole human ecosystem of what they were, the fallible, the everything, the achievements, the whole story. So that's something that I stand very strongly in favor of us thinking about as the library is a spaces for interrogation, for effective interrogation. I have a really quick personal story. My first experience with a monument was the Alamo when I was about 3 or 4 years old. And my dad convinced me that when I hear the phrase, "Remember the Alamo," I should cheer because the Mexicans won. So I thought that that was the appropriate behavior in elementary school. A couple of years later, when everybody else was asked to bow their heads to remember the Alamo, there was one child in the audience that raised her hand and cheered. And I had this moment of cognitive dissonance as a 5-year-old. First, I was really upset at my dad pranking on me like that, but he also was teaching me something, right? He was teaching me that the Alamo story is a different story from my mother's family's perspective, right? It's a different story. And when I had that experience as a young child, I think I was always looking for the Alamo story throughout school. Like, whose Alamo story are we listening to right now? I was thinking about that. And when I moved into the academy and special collections, that stays with me. Like, are we just telling one version? Are we just offering one version of this story for this artifact? So when we think of the word storytelling, stories telling, right, that we understand that there are many narratives that can be extremely personal to that artifact, to very nationally influential. And finally, the only other thing I would say is, as you can see, I really honor the work of my colleagues. I try to remember all their names. Chela Metzger, who is the preservation and conservation head here at UCLA, wrote this fantastic blog, and I'll be happy to share the link at some point. And she talks about the political act of conservation and preservation with statues, or even with the idea of erasing or removing BLM signs or paintings on streets. If you're asking a conservator to go and protect an object to remove the political statement, that is a political act, and there's money involved in that. So we're not disconnected from the acts of our society when those decisions are made. And we have to take our responsibility and our role seriously. And if we're asked to do it, we need to be able to share that this is a complicated endeavor, that we understand what by this act, what we are reinforcing.
Excellent. Would anybody like to respond?
That's my response. Hallelujah to that.
I think that monuments and archives reflect the values of the public. And if monuments are also meant to bring happiness to the public. If these monuments no longer serve the public and no longer bring happiness, they should be brought down. This is a historical process. We see this throughout histories. Just as colonizers removed monuments of the indigenous people of the lands they conquered, and I'm talking about burial grounds, temples, marais, lanais, burial mounds, etc. These should all be re-celebrated. And so in order to make new monuments, I think that our society should do something that we're all proud of again, and make monuments of those things. The monument of Missy Elliott.
Melissa Arnett Elliott, born July 1st, 1971, better known as Missy Elliott. She is an American rapper, singer, songwriter, and record producer. She embarked on her music career with R&B girl group Sista and in the early mid-90s, and then later became a member of the Swing Mob Collective along with her childhood friend and longtime collaborator, Timbaland. Now, the significance of what Natalie is about to talk about, it has been widely discussed that there should be a monument to Missy Elliott because more people actually look up to Missy. Not as many know whoever this guy is.
There's a movement to replace a Confederate statue with Missy Elliott. That would bring joy and happiness. I see you smiling now.
Yes.
And it would reflect the values of a public.
Hallelujah.
Right? And so we need new monuments. And I think that the archives as well need to reflect, like Athena knows, access to who gives donations. Who is giving donations? Who are giving gifts? Mm-hmm. If we want to an archive to reflect a broad and public, then we need much broader, diverse ideas of what collections look like.
For those of you who may be a little like me, I didn't know very much about falas. I didn't know how they work, the significance. I didn't know anything about it. I actually took it all for granted, every single thing, until I spoke with Meliani, Holas Meliani. So if you want to know anything about falas, how they work, the reason why, the significance, go have a conversation, just one simple conversation with Meliani, and you're welcome. Here's Natalie.
My own grandmother, who has a who collected bark cloth, tapa or kapa, throughout her entire life. Each piece of these tapa or natu tell stories of weddings and births and deaths through the act of giving and re-giving. And we need to broaden our ideas of what collections look like, who can give collections, who has access to give a collection.
Oh, Ilaheva, so much of what you said resonated with me, right? Number one, where is this petition? I will sign the Missy Elliott needs a monument. Drop that link in the chat. I will sign it. You've inspired me to listen to the Missy playlist as soon as this Zoom is over. But what I really want to return to is your reminder that monuments should be something that bring us joy, and this idea of the connection between the monument and the public, right? And so thinking about this in a Hawaiian context, I just kind of want to double down on some of the things I said earlier. Like, how can you have that connection to that monument or to that place, like when you cannot physically connect with it, right? And so I think a lot of this has to do with issues of access to land, right? Because so much of what you said in terms of how we can reconceive of what we think of a monument, right? Does it have to be something that is erected by our hands, right? And that if we look to indigenous populations or the peoples who steward the land or have been on the land for so long, right? Sort of in the telling of those stories is recognizing the ways that these monuments have always already existed, right? And so I'm just really grateful that you are sort of pointing out, or at least making me think, we need to prioritize the sort of reciprocal relationship, right? That monuments should not just be something commissioned by someone with like enough money or enough clout to decide how we need to memorialize peoples or actions or places, right? And that a lot of that, depending on where you are and the people who populate that, a lot of that work has already been done, right? So maybe in terms of reconceiving what we think of as a monument, is sort of reconceiving or a reconception of the stories that we need to value, right? To me, I think that comes even before like erecting a monument. Is like, what stories are we telling and what do we value there, right? Right, and obviously this is all informed by my position as a Native Hawaiian, right? And thinking of access to places like, Mauna Kea, but this is something that we can think about throughout the Pacific, right? Like why is so, sorry, I wanna think very carefully about how I'm saying this, right? But this issue is something that we see throughout the Pacific, right? Like more and more square mileage on the island of Guam is being taken away from indigenous peoples, right? Like this is not a Hawaiian thing, this happens all over the Pacific, right? And they will tell you the same things about why areas are named certain things, right? Like the history of that storytelling. And so I think in your conversation about tapo or kapo or siapo, right? Depending on where you are, what you're calling it, what really stood out to me is the way that the story is sort of retold and built upon through that relational element of like the giving and the re-giving, right? So I'm rambling now, but that to me stood out as something like really powerful, and I think is going to help me in terms of rethinking the power of the monument.
Thank you so much. Matt, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, just real quick, I just add to Pua, like Australia is a place where a lot of this is going on right now. Fascinating ways, because you've got a different, because there's a custom. It was like an actually legal custom, of protocol, establishment protocol. You have a very different legal regime with respect to how monuments get created, get navigated, whose authority is involved. There's a collaborative sort of thing that we just don't. United States just doesn't even with NAGPRA, we just don't have. So I think that's really important. I also think of the difficulty with monuments. In part, and also in some ways, their strength is that they have a strange temporality. And they seem to constantly be there, but they also kind of get reanimated. I just think of what the activists and protesters did with the Lee statue and on Monument Avenue in Richmond, turning it into a dance space, turning it into an art space. And there was a lot of Missy Elliott there, right? In that kind of re-signification of that monument. And I just, and I would say maybe one other thing just to address the archives question. So in the area of like making digital resources for literary historical study, which is the thing that I do, I think the kind of work that's being done by like the Colored Conventions Project, for example, or groups like Documenting the Now, I think these kind of point to some of the way to the next generation, for the next generation of academic editors and project builders, because in these cases and it's kind of like what Athena was saying. It's partly about the model that your organization represents of something that is other than colonial, that is something that is more community oriented. It's not just about building a textual resource, but creating social spaces involving community activities, community contributions. In the case of Documenting the Now, not just data sets, but tools for the public to analyze them and to share them. And so I think that there's opportunities there to kind of, in that space, to create a different set of expectations as well.
That's really wonderful. And as we transition to the audience's questions, I just want to mark how special this occasion is, in the sense that we are hosting a roundtable with scholars and information specialists from west of the Mississippi, which is a rarity at Princeton. And in all of their remarks, they have essentially helped us, what I would consider, provincialize the empire, provincialize the colonial power, particularly by orienting those of us on the East Coast toward the Pacific, and asking us to consider, what if the United Kingdom, what if the United States are not just granted imperial knowledge or epistemic status, but can be seen as one island, quote unquote, in a world of islands. And by recentering Tonga, by recentering Hawaii, what kind of knowledge might be produced out of these contexts? And I just want to stress that for those of us who happen to be on the East Coast at Princeton, this Pacific methodology is so important for us. And I want to thank all four of you for at least bringing us to that place. It really is a rarity for our institution.
I swear I'm crying.
That said, and I think this gets into our previous conversation, Micah Langer asks a very good question that gets us back to the question of decolonization, and perhaps a positive spin on that is this term re-indigenizing. Micah's heard this used as an alternative to decolonizing in a CBC interview with the archivist for the Carrier-Sakani Tribal Council. And he was wondering if the panelists have heard of this term re-indigenizing, if it's gaining preference in discussions, and if you all believe that it's perhaps more useful or at any rate different from talk about decolonization. Ilaheva, this gets us to your very good point that monuments have already been there. And they have been erased, and simply taking down the Confederate statue might be thought of not as a desecration, but a re-indigenizing of what was already undoubtedly there. But I invite you all to think of re-indigenizing as a positive term that might be associated with decolonization.
Well, let me just say that this is the first time that I'm hearing this. And immediately my heart beats harder, thinking about the ways that this term participates in decolonizing by decentering colonization and recentering indigenous knowledge production centers. I love it. I'm all for it. I say go.
Me too! Snaps for you, Nats! Okay. I'm just talking to myself at this point, but anyways.
Anyone want to second the endorsement or qualify it in any way?
Can I qualify it? And I'm not
a
scholar?
So also,
that's for sure.
Yes, I second Ilaheva's statement, right? I guess the one qualification I would offer is to push for specificity in how we think of indigenous. I often see with students who are very well-meaning, right, but are maybe just beginning to learn that there are many other like knowledge or ways of seeing the world out there and all types of epistemologies out there. And so sometimes I just worry about folks who use indigenous very broadly, right? Like indigenous peoples think this, or an indigenous worldview, and obviously I've said the phrase an indigenous worldview before, right? But I would say push to be very specific in your language, especially depending on like where you are teaching, where those students are from, right? So teaching in Hawaii, when I say a Kanaka perspective or a Pacific perspective, that is sort of like an inherently re-indigenous or re-indigenized statement, right? So yes, I am also all for it. I love it, but just with the qualification that I push for folks to be very specific there, and maybe adopt the language of the place that they are in.
I think that actually leads us to Vinit Agarwal's question, and it asks you to, all four of you, to elaborate on this question of land. just as indigeneity is not an abstract concept, I think for all four of you, land is a material and sort of specific place whose access needs to be redressed and whose status as property needs to be questioned. Vinit says, I want to ask about externalization and categorization of land in archives. What are the strategies against such categorization as it ties into search systems when, as Pua just said, perhaps a re-indigenizing effort would get us to be specific about the lands that we're talking about and actually taking the time, not just to say state of Georgia, state of New Jersey, but to actually name the lands and perhaps to include them as part of our search terms or categories. I invite any of you to reflect on that question, the specificity of place, as Pua just said.
I really like the, I'm gonna choose my venture in these questions where I feel most comfortable. I want to spin a little on the idea of space and access and that intersection in the library. I think a lot of people like to hear examples about this in real practical senses. I worked at a very highly ranked R1 institution, and I invited a speaker who had created an artist book, but in order to tell the story, he performed a dance and to music and came in because that is actually the cover of his book, was the entrance, and the music was the illustration of his books, and the display was the text, and then the engagement with the people in the audience was the story. And I was shushed by some colleagues that I had brought something into the library that was inappropriate, it seemed like. And I didn't have the kind of leadership chops I have now to shush back, but I'm glad I have them now. But what I was able to do is really think about the adaptive nature of spaces and that way that some of you were mentioning, like access to materials, access to telling stories, requires that sometimes very intimate engagement with the materiality that speaks to the cultural manifestation of its being, right? If it's music, if it's song, if it's dance, if it's anything. And the library, the archive, not being able to supply that space for those types of engagement are doing a disservice and actually aren't ethically stewarding the collections well, right? I would call them out on that. So something I think a lot of my colleagues across the United States are thinking about their spaces adaptively. I'm thinking about work done by many of my colleagues in the idea of the reading room, right? And the reading room as this quiet gentleman's library that you're supposed to sit there and let the objects teach you rather than interrogate them. So when I think about space, I think about the space of public space that's supposed to be in our library. So that's a part of the question I hope will kind of, I hope for your querent that might help give some context of what I'm thinking about. But I totally am excited to hear answers related to other parts.
Yeah, I think on the other end of that sort of spectrum, on the metadata end, because I think this is one of the sort of tricky, at least for those of us working in historical collections and working on previous periods where you've got layer upon layer upon layer of renaming of space and place, right? On the one hand, one of the most powerful developmental areas in code, today has to do with geolocation. It has to do with the having the technology in your pocket that all of those obsessed, greedy explorers dreamed of, right? And the flows of information that go through that by virtue of you're merely moving around, right? Your movement in space is tracked and turned into is turned into data to be sold. So on the one hand, we're able for the first time with geographic information systems and standardized naming systems, we're able to say, no, this place is not just, it's not just Lincoln, Nebraska, right? It's 8, 10, 12 other places all at the same time, and we can give access to that electronically. But even as we do that, those nominations can fall under that automatable regime. They can be folded back into that kind of knowledge grab that constitutes the creation of surplus value for Google and for Apple and for so on. So we actually, in the Chestnut Archive in particular, because Chestnut, who grew up both in North Carolina and in the North, in Cleveland, he's got a very careful attentiveness to this. He gives fictional names to everything, but everything is a thin veil, and so you can encode this stuff. But we actually delayed it, and we're actually in conversation with a bunch of other groups because we're not really sure actually what kinds of constraints we're going to be able to put on the use of that information. And so that's something. I mean, I don't have an answer except to say that I think that question is a really serious one. All the way from kind of the reading room to the satellite.
Can I just say I love that phrase, knowledge grab? That's a good one.
Another way of resisting capture is brought up by Jenna Mead, who just asks that from an Indigenous Australian perspective, that we be mindful that re-indigenizing obscures the powerful fact that sovereignty over country was never ceded. So country or land was always and will always be indigenous. So that is the kind of words we use can contain within them the sort of epistemic presumptions that we have. Jenna's helpful reminder, I think, might lead us into this other question that both Alex Diaz-Hui and Marley Ayu ask in their different ways, which is, Marley asks, what are some of the ways to decolonize the body's knowledge? And Alex's question is similar in that he's asking, does the process or action of decolonization have an endpoint, or is it constantly ongoing even after land repatriation? And I hear both of them asking us to think about decolonization as something that's not just about institutions or monuments, but about habits of being and habits of moving in the world. But between these two, can you help us think about decolonization even on an intimate or personal level?
I'm sorry, can you repeat those two questions for me just one more time? There's so many things I want to say, and I want to make sure I distill it down to what they were actually asking.
What are the ways to decolonize the body's knowledge, the knowledge we carry in our bodies? And the other question is, does the process or action of decolonization have an endpoint, or is it constantly ongoing even after land repatriation? One is arguably more bodily, the other is more temporal, but I hear both as asking about, can we think of decolonization beyond institutions as embodied, or even as something that we continue even after repatriation, if that happens?
Okay, I'm gonna take, all right, guys, as the young people say, I'm still processing. There's so many things that I wanna say. First, Marley Lake sounds very familiar. Aloha, Marley. But as someone who does a lot of work on embodied knowledges and practices, right? To me, I think there is something very powerful in sort of returning to whatever the storytelling potential of your body is. So for me, again, as a diasporic Kanaka Maoli, my mom put us in a hula halau in Southern California. So halau hula namia kanu olaka o Hawaii. Auntie Mahalo was our kumu, right? And so for me as a child, that really unlocked the potential of my own body as a site of storytelling, but also one that was rooted in all of the other bodies who had performed that same story before me. So depending on what your halau is, you will learn that, like, yes, a kaholo is 3 steps, but in this halau, it's 3 steps and a tap. In this halau, there's no tap, right? Like, even down to how you perform, your body performs a certain motion, or a particular iteration of a dance. Like, in that, you don't just learn the movements, you learn the knowledge that your kumu passes down to you. They learned from their kumu, who learned from their kumu. And so your body becomes part of this larger genealogy of storytelling. And so for me, there was something really powerful to sit and think, like, the dance that I'm doing now is the same dance that my kupuna did maybe like 100 years ago, 200 years before that. And so just thinking about the ways my own body produces knowledge in that context, I think was really helpful, and is probably the best answer I can offer to that first question.
I was gonna say dance too, right away. Like, just, you know, that's one way. Gloria Ansaldua's meditation on this in Borderlands La Frontera comes to mind as well. And that one of the things that she stresses there is how difficult this process is, navigating between not just like the difficulty of disentangling the colonial from, you know, from what has been given to you as the traditional, but at the same time reforming a relationship through your own desires and your own your own sort of character and sense of the world back through that which has been given. And that, you know, it's for her a profound struggle, euphoric and also, you know, nauseating and tremendously difficult. The one thing I'll say in with respect to like the eternal decolonial is that the redisposition of the land doesn't end this process, because there are this is a struggle. This is always a struggle. So I'd say there's decolonization and then there's decolonializing. In other words, that to get out of a sort of situation in which one preserves the residue of the expectation of the possibility to imperialize, the possibility to dominate. That process is ongoing, I think.
I also feel like we're a little bit in the very, very beginning stages, if not the first draft, of making these efforts. So I get tired, and I know you do too. And a lot of people the last several months have come up into something that I believe many of us on this call have been dealing with our whole entire lives. And it's getting some massive sunlight and some massive momentum. And I don't want that momentum to just be a point in time. I want it to be a change in our approach. And so when I think about what you called the eternal decolonial, Matt, I recognize that, because one of the things I work with now is the realization of the very necessary reparative work we have to do in our spaces. The way Dorothy Berry once said, you know, thinking that you can repair 400 years of injustice with a couple of months of changing your policies is actually quite unprofessional. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of repairing our relationships, even amongst ourselves. something that I had to think about when one of my colleagues, Devin Fitzgerald, brought forward the feminist bibliographies at UCLA, and we had a great forum, and he asked me to do the opening remarks. And I was really open about how I have perpetuated the patriarchy, because in my early career, I let my ideas become second to some already structured authority, right? I thought, well, mine's not really the most important point to make, so I have to align myself with this thing that's printed in the book and described. And so the way we have to unlock and unlearn is going to take a generation or so. And my hope is that our grandchildren will be proud of us. That's like my ultimate hope.
I want to round things out with a final set of questions. And here I would just like to ask about the possibilities of making space in your respective institutions, libraries, for things like Indigenous oral histories, for things like Kappa and Tapa. And Athena, this goes right back to your anecdote that you shared with us. That R1 institution was not prepared for the kind of book, and let's call that performance a book, that you brought in. How can we help institutions open their doors to Kappa and Tapa, to books such as that one? And all the while bearing in mind Lehua Yim's point that there is also, and Matt, you touched on this earlier, a limit to what should be shared. That there is kapu and tapu in Native traditions that isn't about, well, we'll just give you everything and that'll be it. How do we strike that balance of opening our doors while protecting communities and abiding by their wishes for what should remain with them, as it were?
I'll start. I mentioned before the rethinking knowledge production centers, like Europe in the 18th century, and imagining how these centers came to fill up the archives with their knowledge producing objects like books. While other knowledge producing objects like, say, Kappa or Marshallese stick maps that record ocean swells that are amazing, beautiful knowledge producing objects are labeled artifacts. Some of them are, objects that live in either libraries or museums. The Kappa is already there in the archive, but they are in museum archives. They are not there to be, like Athena said, interrogated. So I want to begin by thinking of, like we said, other kinds of knowledge producing objects as knowledge production, and not just books and the written word as the only sources of objects where we produce knowledge. And I agree, Kinohi, that so many of these things that that end up in museums were not meant to be in museums. Were not given, they were either bought or plundered. If they had remained in their families from whence they came, they would have stayed in their families. It's still a very fine line. But Kappa is meant to be given. And if Kappa, if it was given to an archive in good faith, like other collections are, right? We would take, Thank you.
Right. So, like, to piggyback off of that, I think one thing we really need to keep in mind is that caveat, that qualification of in good faith. And the simplest answer I can give is that the people from these communities need to be in like the room where these conversations are happening, right? And so I have been really fortunate to spend time at universities that at least make the effort, right, in terms of indigenous spaces, right? So University of Hawaii likes to call itself a Hawaiian place of learning, and in many ways it can be, right? Obviously there are several ways that it could do better, right? And we don't have that much time, but I will make that caveat. But I will say that there is a school of Hawaiian knowledge, right? There are places there that folks can go to have these conversations. But the question is, who is the steward of that space, right? So I previously had a postdoc at University of Oregon, right? And there's a longhouse there. And there was someone on staff who comes from that community. And so there were strict rules about what you could do or could not do in that space, right? Like no cursing, don't kill things, don't exchange money, right? But there need to be people from those communities, not just saying, oh, it's great that you gave us a space, right? But there need to be people there enforcing what should and should not happen, and also who should and should not view those artifacts, if that's what we're going to call them, right? And also sharing certain knowledges, because one thing we need to keep in mind as academics who sort of idealize this quest and this thirst for knowledge, right? The unquenchable desire to learn more is often what motivated us to enter into the positions that we're in. But sometimes no is what you need to hear, right? Like the idea that not all knowledge is for everybody, right? I think is something that we need to keep in mind, right? And so having folks from these communities not necessarily function as gatekeepers, but to borrow, right, this Hawaiian or Pacific context, understanding like the boundaries of kapu or tapu, right? And what they might be, and not just understanding them as prohibitive, right? But understanding, right, that there is value and potential there, right? Because sometimes no can be a productive word in a productive space, right? So just my quick answer is have those people from those communities in those rooms and crafting those spaces and cataloging those things, but also really listen when you are told no. Like really listen when something is not for you and should not be for you, and take that as a learning experience.
I love that, Pua. I have said, gosh, many times I'm like, I'm sorry, a policy is not tradition. Please don't tell me it's your tradition to do this. A policy is something that we need to address and make sure that the policy affects the people who we have brought into agency, and it works with their materiality. Because if your policy keeps things from happening in that way that respects and honors the agents of those collections, if it keeps that from taking place, and you call that this is our tradition, then our stuff doesn't belong there. Then you have a different tradition than what I think of. And I really push back when people tell me traditional librarianship or traditional collecting. Like, those are not traditions, those were decisions. and they're habits, and they're typical. I think of tradition in a very sacred way. I think of it in a totally different context. And I think everybody who says something is a tradition, it better be a benefit to all the parties involved, right? It better be something that everyone is buying into. When you mentioned, Ilaheva, you said when archives have filled up with these materials, I think about my colleague like Tamar Evangelista Doherty and Gerald Beasley at Cornell recently with their special collections, repatriating the Mohegan Diary and the act of that. And what I love about this is what 100% the recovery of their story, recovery of their cultural heritage, but also the attempt, and I hope will become a different connection and relationship that institution has from this point onward with those tribal communities. And that is, I think, the enduring part of repatriation is less about the collections and more about the connections, right? And it's about how we've been able to. So I'm okay with this. And what's going to get in the way is going to be the law. It's going to be when people say this is our institutional tradition. I'm all for wearing red on Fridays. That's a great tradition. But if, but that's very different than, you know, we have to make sure that they sign the deed of gift when we own everything, right? That's a different way to call something a tradition. So I think choosing our words
really
carefully, and
just
the bottom
doing what
line,
you
I
want.
love your list of things. Well, I would say also hire people that represent these backgrounds and give them agency and let them grow in leadership and let them affect how we do business,
Yes,
how we do engagement.
yes,
Let them
child,
have power.
yes.
That would be my answer.
Say that thing.
Yeah, I got nothing to say.
That's
It's
right.
right on.
Yeah.
It's about polishing the chain, and it's hard to get an institution sometimes to understand that it's about relationships. But that's been the message from everywhere for so long, and so yeah, I totally agree.
And okay, what you guys were both saying about relationships also made me think, as an academic, right? That we need to count that work that people do, right? So many times when we're evaluated on research, teaching, and service, but sometimes that service work goes above and beyond for certain people, right? And maintaining those ties to those communities and those relationships, that is a form of intellectual and emotional labor, right? And I think one thing institutions can do better is recognize the work and the value of those folks who are going out into the community, disseminating knowledge, and also learning from those communities and maintaining those relationships, right? So to me, one thing academies and universities and museums and all these archival spaces need to do better is recognizing the value in that labor, right? Because if it was easy, like everyone would do it and we wouldn't be having these conversations.
And I'll just say for those of you out there, you know, who are designing grant program guidelines, who are coming up with university policies, you may want to rethink your language of deliverables. Because where does that come from? What is that about? Is a relationship a deliverable? You know?
This has been an incredibly humbling experience in the best way possible. I want to highlight Athena's point that this is not just about, or even primarily about collections, but about connections, and talk about a way of challenging institutions and Western epistemes when we prioritize relationality and respect over individual achievement and possession. This came down to us and it doesn't belong to you. I want to thank all of you in the audience for attending today's roundtable. I want to thank those who asked Q&As, and if I couldn't get to them, I apologize, but look, this is just the beginning of a conversation we want to have at Princeton. Emma and I will seek to revisit your questions in our future event in March titled Fictioning Archives, but we also invite you to continue following the Archival Silences Working Group, where we hope to take up your questions and we'll have these archived, okay? So again, March, Fictioning Archives will be our final event of the year. But for now, won't you please join me in thanking Matt Cohen, Athena Jackson, Ilaheva Tuaone, and Pua Warren for joining us today for this remarkable and wonderful conversation. Thanks to all of you for being here with us. With that, on behalf of Emma Sarconi, I want to thank you for joining us. Be safe, we wish you well, and have a pleasant end to the school year. Thank you.